But we have a very, very important discussion now because we are experiencing, obviously, right now that resources are really important. We can see that crude oil is driving all other assets. And we wanted to have a discussion about the role of critical resources. We don't want to focus only on what's going to happen in the Strait of Hormuz in the next couple of days. We want to take a longer-term perspective as well. So I'd like to welcome to the stage both Grant Wilson and Wouter Youngblood. So you can come in, Grant. Don't be shy. Yeah. So Grant Wilson actually used to be Exante Data's head of Asia, and he was helping us out in a crucial time when COVID hit. I remember very, very clearly that Grant and I had a discussion late in one evening about, okay, should we take this COVID thing seriously? And it was in the middle of January 2020. Fortunately, we made the decision to allocate half the entire team to forecast COVID for the next several months. And there was a window where a lot of people didn't know how to forecast COVID, so it was very helpful, so we appreciate that, Grant. Grant has now moved on, and he is in a critical sector, i.e. critical minerals. He's executive chairman, which means that he's both CEO and chair, effectively, of a growing mining operation in Australia called Tivan, and has unique perspective on what's happening in that sector. And then we have Wouter Youngblood, who handles our political risk analysis on a day-to-day basis, right from tariffs to the Strait of Hormuz. There's plenty of stuff to analyze there. Wouter has a PhD in law, so that is one of the ways he complements the team, right? We have a number of people who are focused on finance and economics, but Wouter has this law angle that's very helpful for some of these issues. So, Wouter, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, by all means. Thank you, Jens. Grant, epic. We're going to focus on bottlenecks. And bottlenecks in the supply chains, in real and actual supply chains. I would normally say none greater than the rare earths, but in this particular case, oil is part of the agenda, and we will touch on that later. If I see the slides right up there, we might need to click through some slides on rocket count. I don't believe that that's relevant right now. And we can start with the real business of
yeah. I'm going to stand up just to make myself more comfortable and make sure I'm on the right slides, if that's okay. So, good morning, everyone. It's great to be back in New York City. I lived here for 10 years. My first trip back since 2018, because as Jens mentioned, there was a pandemic in the middle. And about 3 years ago, I decided to pivot my career back in Australia and take control of a failing mining company, just for kicks. So I've always been drawn to challenges. The work that I did with Exante was a great time to be involved with Jens and the team. I've got great admiration for Exante. Proud that I made a contribution during that period. And it's great to see everyone here, because one of the things I did always see with Exante was the strength of the networks that Jens and the team had built up globally. And so to see everyone here in person today is great. For myself, I wanted a new challenge. I'd worked in sovereign wealth funds for about 10 years with Singapore's government in Asia. And then I'd built my own hedge funds here in New York for about 10 years. Secretary Percent was also one of my anchors. I'm so very grateful for Scott's support from Soros at that time. But when I got back, I wanted to jump into the critical minerals sector. I could see that there was going to be a big clash between the East and the West. I'm good at building companies, doing new things, so I wanted to get my hands on a listed entity. So Tivan, which stands for titanium and vanadium, is a listed company. I ran a hostile campaign to get control. And the real vision was that I could see what was happening in China, and I think the West has been largely asleep at the wheel on critical minerals. In the US, you have a really tortured history. It runs through a company called Magna Quench back in the 80s. It was ultimately bought and developed by GM and then punted to the Chinese in the early 2000s. They actually had the technology on early stage neodymium magnets, which are now so important throughout various civil and military applications.
Marissa, if they're finished early, is that a problem?
And you have another storied a sort of catastrophe called Molycorp, which is now MP Materials. And so I could see all this in Australia playing out. But what was really discernible from an analytical point of view is that China had started to build a very systematic method of controlling their exports of critical resources. This is minerals, mineral processing, technologies, logic change, chemicals, you name it. And effectively, they went through 5 or 6 iterations of what's known as the dual-use items and technologies catalogue. What it means right now is that China is able to, with great precision, target export controls down to the supply chain, down to the country, down to the company. And it's this system-wide control which has been built up over about 20 years, while the West was otherwise occupied, shall we say. And so particularly around 2021, once it gained legislative sovereignty in terms of the export control law, it was clear for those of us in Australia that there might be an opportunity to build a critical mineral sector. We knew that we'd need a lot of involvement from the government, and we knew that we'd need to start diversifying away from China. China's Australia's biggest exporter. But the idea really was that I had was that if I could get control of a company, I'd be able to go on a bit of an acquisition spree, buy a bunch of critical minerals in Australia, projects, deposits, build a team out, and ultimately try to build relationships in Asia, ex-China, and build a proper company, a sustainable company, because any good company is trying to solve a hard problem. And so Tivan's problem is to supply Japan with critical resources from the north of Australia. That's essentially the mission of our company. But it is worth studying from a macro point of view what's actually happened here. It does, in my view, reflect hegemonic decline. We saw, I think in February, in the House, in Congress, in DC, the US passed a bill. I don't think it's passed the Senate yet. Vada might be able to correct me on this, but it was called the Critical Minerals Dominance Act. This is an act of hubris. The US can never be independent in critical minerals, much less dominant. And I'll explain where I think it's trending on the next couple of slides. But the basic message from Asia is that the Chinese had their heads down. They've built out incredible capabilities from the upstream through to the midstream. They've now systematized control. And this framework should be understood by pretty much every macro trader on the planet. It is starting to be operationalized. In January, when the Chinese were unhappy with some comments from Prime Minister Takaishi about Taiwan, they've effectively targeted 20 of Japan's largest heavy industry companies with this list, and they've effectively prevented exports of critical minerals to these companies, and that will make their life very difficult in about 6 months' time. So it's a form of leverage. It's part of the architecture now, and it's fundamentally sort of misunderstood. Essentially, it's a blind spot, I would say. In terms of how to think about it, it's this vast array of technical language. It's all in Chinese, of course. We took a lot of time translating this. AI might get there these days, but we've done it from scratch. If you go through, you'll see an evolution across different forms of critical minerals. The critical minerals thematic is becoming a bit more widespread. There's popular consciousness of it now. But if you look at it through this prism, you'll see where China's priorities were. Fluorine, nickel, uranium, titanium. The semiconductor materials have really kicked in the past couple of years. So here we see great emphasis on gallium, for example, germanium. In terms of the military supply chain, and again, think here where the US is. The US has about 2,000 weapons systems in terms of the Department of Defense. It's estimated that 60 to 70% of the supply chains which feed those weapons systems have some form of dependency on China. It's an incredible number. A lot of that dependency is gallium, antimony, germanium, tungsten, tantalum. Those would be the main ones. And you'll see, particularly 2024, 25, 26, China's starting to mobilize their export control list. And you've seen a pretty dramatic price reaction in a number of these critical minerals as a consequences. With China, it is always better to look at what they're doing rather than just what they're saying. So another way to view this evolution of China's response to critical minerals and their desire to gain strategic control over all of these value chains is to look at trade data. And with the help of Exante, I went back to the team. Alex Etra deserves a lot of thanks for this. Juan and Maria as well. We pulled apart some relatively complicated trade statistics across different critical minerals. And the idea here for me, running a company in Australia, was let's please target those critical minerals that Australia may still have some endowment in and where China might be strategically vulnerable. If there's a shock, China may not have enough. Can the West fight back by targeting and building capabilities in critical minerals, some critical minerals where they have vulnerabilities? And you'll see, just in the past year especially, obviously a dramatic move in tungsten has become quite a popular macro trade. I know a couple of high-profile hedge fund managers that are involved in a tungsten company here in the US. Tivan, as I'll show you in a second, has our own tungsten project. And fluorspar, not very well known. The element there is fluorine, incredibly important in semiconductors, in EV batteries, nuclear enrichment, metals fluctuating, refrigerant, the list just goes on and on. And if you scroll back one chart, the number one in terms of China's focus, the most ubiquitous critical mineral in the establishment in China is fluorine. And so with the help of Exante, we were incredibly early in Australia, and Tivan acquired the only two high-grade, high-purity fluorite resources in the country for less than $10 million, both of them, potentially 50 years of mine life here. And proudly, just last week, when Prime Minister Takeshi met with President Trump in Washington, they announced a critical minerals action plan, which I'll turn to next. As part of that, 13 projects globally were named as the locus of cooperation, early stage cooperation between Australia and Japan. Projects deemed to be so critical that these governments would offer additional early stage support, financing, facilitation, and proudly Tivan's Speewah Fluorite project was on that very, very select list. So a good example of why data matters, perhaps, and perhaps going back to some roots in my hedge fund days, and certainly with Exante, the idea of drilling, and not accepting the AI slop either, understanding that there's still room for creative human intelligence, and good decisions can follow from that, and hopefully good things as well. These slides can be pulled out across a number of other critical minerals, and you can start to diagnose where China itself has problems, because obviously when China starts importing that degree of a certain mineral, it tells you very clearly that they also have vulnerabilities, whether they're hoarding or whether they are looking to add value to re-export. Sometimes that's open for debate, but these moves are so dramatic, and they're mirrored across a number of other critical minerals that they're hard to argue with when you look at the full context. And so on a brighter note, the summit between Takeshi and Trump led to what I do think is ultimately the path forward. For a period, it appeared that the US was going to try to go it alone here. There was a series of transactions through last year. For anyone that's sort of in the space, MP Materials was the poster child. They set a price floor on NdPr. The government took some equity in MP Materials, and then there started to be a range of other transactions in lithium, some more in rare earths. The US wading in with different forms of financial support for some of the local projects. For those that are, I guess, insiders, as I am now in the sector, no one really believed that this was sufficient. There was no real path for the US to progress very far by themselves. And what you instead needed was to build a bilateral or indeed plurilateral response, to build a counterweight to China. And so that has really started with the announcement last Thursday. It was great to see this language being used. I would credit Secretary Besant for a lot of the thought leadership here. One of the reasons I believe the critical minerals sector was left to the Chinese to take this ascendancy was that there was always a reluctance to intervene in the free market. And I think Scott, with his economic historian hat on, was able to make the intellectual case last year for broad-scale intervention, including things like price floors and stockpiles. And I hope as well that, and I believe, that he's been influential in broadening out the US response to allies. There's no way the US can take this on by itself. So the first step was to partner with the country that is the most influential outside of China in critical minerals, the most developed in terms of supply chains, the largest trading houses, the most considered commitment to national stockpiling that exists, the longest pedigree in critical minerals by far, and that's Japan. I expect that this plurilateral response will broaden out in the next couple of years to firstly move upstream, so that would be Australia, with our resourcing pedigree, probably Canada. You would expect to join this initiative if Mark Carney can allow that to happen. I'm sure Mark will see the bigger picture in this particular sector. A third tier might be Korea and India, and then probably last, and probably to Wouter's chagrin, will be Europe. No one really wants to work with Europe. They're too slow and too bureaucratic. And so what you'll see here is a US pipeline. These are some of the projects that were announced, in a sense, on a unilateral basis over the past year, combined with some of the projects that were named on that list. You might be shocked to see these rough guidance on timeframes, but that's how hard this is to build a mine. The projects that Tivan's developing in Australia, and we're working faster than anyone, will take anywhere between 3 and 5 years to develop and to deliver first production. Most of these projects will take a lot longer. The US lacks capabilities in terms of engineering, especially metallurgy, project execution. You've hollowed out your mining sector to such a degree that it's very hard to turn it back on, particularly with the most complex and challenging sector that you can imagine in mining. And so there are a couple of projects here at the top that I think will have legs. The Korea Zinc's an outstanding company. It's midstream. So welcome to Tennessee. The lithium projects, it's extremely low grade. It'll be challenging. Red Dog's established, so that's a chance. Resolution will be a poster child for the copper sector. It's all the way underground. It's a huge resource though, and these are obviously the biggest companies in the world looking to build it. They're through on environmentals, as I understand it, but it's very hot underground, very dangerous, and so we'll see how that goes. As you move down the list, it just degrades. US rare earths, it's round top, I would view as a scam. It was very upsetting for people in the sector to see the US government back that in the way that they did. It was an appalling headline to print. For everyone in the sector, we know that project's not even close to being viable. So the people involved in that should really question why they did it when it's glaringly obvious to anyone that's spent even a month in mining that project cannot happen. Greenland is obviously something that perhaps Wouter might have a view on from a geopolitical point of view. From a mining point of view, incredibly challenging. CapEx will be off the chart, and there's no real place to send it to other than China, even if you got it out of the ground. And so hopefully some of the noise will settle down there in the time ahead. But I would say that there's at least a credible pipeline that's been built. The US will be welcomed to the world of top-tier mining projects and start to remember how challenging it really is to build something. In Australia, it's getting harder and harder and harder, but there are paths through for certain projects. And in this particular sector, there'll be a couple of levers, I think, available that haven't been available before. And so the real heart of the plurilateral trade initiative are two things: price support mechanisms and then stockpiles. And these are the final two things that I'd like to mention. If it were just left to private markets, as we've seen over 20 years, I don't think that the sector would be capable of being built in the West, even if you combined Japanese ingenuity, American leadership, innovation and incredible endowments in places like Australia and Canada, some demand from Korea and Europe. You still wouldn't get there because the cycle, and particularly China's economic coercion of the cycle, would mean that projects would fail in the first couple of years. This is the lesson from Molycorp, and there's any number of other examples I could show you which illustrate that as challenging it is to build a project finance stack to get through a couple of years of construction, those first couple of years when you're trying to make revenue, if China then crashes the price, you will go out of business. And they did so again and again throughout the sector. And so part of the plurilateral initiative and part of what's been achieved over the past year is price floors. There's various ways to structure price floors. You can arrange them on commercial terms. If you're in a strong enough position as a producer, you can say, okay, we're going to agree this price floor here. And if the price takes off, I'm going to give up some part of my profits. And that's starting to happen in rare earths, NdPr. But where I think it is heading is into the sort of the middle zone here, where you have stockpiles and governments being prepared to warehouse a significant amount of the said critical mineral to create some redundancy in the system as well, because everything moved to just in time. And then when you have a shock, it's not really going to help anyone. The alternative model is sort of financial intervention, where the price floor is enforced by a contract for difference. So if the off-taker is paying a certain price and isn't able to secure a profit on selling it, and in fact has to sell it lower, there's some form of underwriting from a government institution. So this model has become relatively popular in some circles. Hasn't been operationalized yet, but it did show up in the MP material deal a little bit. And so there's sort of a competition at the moment, a thought competition between, should the stockpile-based model prevail? Should financial intervention prevail? It'll probably go case by case. What's really required is coordination across governments, across borders, across tax regimes. But we're seeing enough movement, and we're seeing enough movement in enough critical minerals for me to believe that this is underway, that it's credible. Obviously, we're not going hard right. It's the command economy sort of situation. The midstream's incredibly complicated. TCRC refers to treatment and refining charges. This is a bit technical, but you can imagine if there's a mineral processing facility and they're competing for concentrate, unless you've actually got some sort of price support there as well, you can have a situation where China just hoovers in all of the concentrate and feeds their facilities, depriving the West of the supply. So it's very difficult to operationalize a response to these sorts of topics, but price floors are coming. I think they will be rolled out across 5 to 10 critical minerals, as I'll show on the next page. It's doable without egregious amounts of capital being deployed, and I do think it is ultimately necessary. It will also mean for companies such as Tivan that we will have our earnings de-risked if we get into production on our projects, and so that will make it in turn easier for us to raise money. It'll be very constructive for our share price and so on and so forth. So there are very significant opportunities, investment opportunities in the sector as a result of this form of policy intervention. And so the final slide, this would be my sort of back of the envelope list of where I think most of the support will be focused. It's a function of criticality. So these commodities on the left, or critical minerals on the left, are vital to particularly military supply chains, semiconductor supply chains, the energy transition, even though that's become much less of an emphasis over the past 2 years, I think that will come back. And so that's your shopping list. You'll see here, market size. Again, these are not dramatic numbers. If there is underwriting of supply from the West, it's not going to stretch the sovereign balance sheet egregiously, and yet it will create that incentive to bring Western supply to the market. And so the view that I've held and the view that I've advocated for with government, whether that's the Japanese government, and we're working in partnership with the Japanese government, in Australia and here in the US is that relative to the criticality and what's at stake here, there's so much at stake. These numbers are small. You can throw a blanket over 10 of the most critical minerals, and you can achieve a lot. And so I do think that that narrative has carried the day. It's not to say it's going to be easy. It will not be easy. But I think you'll see over the next, say, 5 years, a lot of the policy modalities that I've highlighted today normalized. And I think this list here will be right front and center, with perhaps uranium the most controversial on that list. I think the rest of them will be operationalized in the next 1 to 2 years. And so finally, that's my company now. Very proud of having been able to transition. I think in life today, in careers, there's a lot of domain specificity. People get caught up being brilliant at one thing. You have to be brilliant at one thing in some ways to achieve. I've sort of rejected that. I think it's possible to chase challenges and to define new purposes and new horizons, to put yourself in uncomfortable positions and see what happens. I did this company because the first project that was available in the critical minerals was also next to my hometown, right there in the middle of Australia, Alice Springs. This is a very remote part of Australia in the grey. To give you a sense, that's 3 times the size of Texas. That's our playfield. And yet there's only 1% of Australia's very small population living there. We're also the dominant company in a small country called Timor to the north. So you're all welcome to come visit one day. We'll have to set up a little tour business on the side, mine tourism in Australia. You can bring your Crocodile Dundee memorabilia. It's the same. It's exactly the same place right at the top there. Crocodiles are on our safety list. We see them regularly. We don't carry knives, but we do carry guns. But hopefully we won't need either of those things. And hopefully we can find a path where the West can build a credible counterbalance in the critical minerals sector to China, and that through that process we can resume more balanced trade and a form of complex interdependence where China needs us and the West is going to need China. There's no way through without China, so people need to understand that and reconcile with that. But certainly the equilibrium position ahead is where there's been intervention in the critical minerals sector leading to a sustainable set of pathways, some renewal, and hopefully the coming together of like-minded countries to establish that ballast and counterweight to China, and to establish a free trade once again that would benefit everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. That was amazing. There's a couple of questions that come in that I want to address first before jumping to oil. They're basically split along 3 things. One is capital. Where is it coming from? Is it US capital? Is it European capital? Is it Chinese capital? I know that Australia has had some considerations along the lines of where is capital coming from. What do you see happening in the sector? Where's capital being deployed from? Where is it coming from?
So in general, in project development, you're trying to raise both debt and equity. And the debt side has been relatively available from sovereign credit and export agencies. So here in the US, you'll have US Exim, for example. The Japanese equivalent is JBIC. The Australian equivalent is the Export Finance Australia. Europe has the same as well. Debt is relatively plentiful, but it's always offered on a conditional basis. You have to have already effectively sold your product. You have to have established pricing terms, and you have to have margins. But most of all, you have to have the equity. Right. And the equity is incredibly challenging to raise. To give you a sense, when I started Tivan, the company was functionally bankrupt, and it was a struggle even for me to raise the early stage capital to what was required. I ended up going offshore to hedge fund networks and so on and so forth. So the equity is the challenge. In our case, because we've worked in partnership with Japan, we've got large-scale equity from Sumitomo Corporation and from the Japanese government. And so that's your best case. There are increasing interest from private equity, I would say, like they understand the opportunity. particularly when you start hearing about price floors, because they understand that automatically the company that owns that project can be transferred into like a hybrid security. You've got your downstream earnings protected, low risk, relatively low risk, and if there's a shock, you can make a fortune with these companies. So I'm seeing private equity. We're definitely seeing Asian equity coming in. The Europeans have their checkbook out. They just signed a free trade agreement with Australia a couple of days ago. But it comes at a cost working with Europe, and that's speed and decisiveness, and we're certainly not interested. So it's a mix. Yeah, but it's the hardest nut, as always, is equity.
Is equity. On the European question, there's one question in there, and it's always was vexing to me to understand how much of the critical minerals are already in the system. Europe has this idea of the circular economy, don't throw it away, we'll recycle it, we'll pull it out, we don't really have to mine all that much.
Yeah.
How much, to your sense, is already in there, and how much is needed?
Yeah, recycling it sounds fanciful. It's not. It's incredibly important, and anything that can reduce the reliance upon primary sources of minerals is welcome. And so you'll see a very established ecosystem of recycling across established base metals and then critical minerals that can occur as well. Some of these critical minerals are incredibly difficult to recycle. Like fluorine is an example. Once the chemicals are bonded, it's so expensive to unbond them. And this could be PFAS, this could be hydrofluorocarbons, extracting it from water. It is so cost prohibitive that you're going to end up mining it. Tungsten's an example. There's a lot of tungsten as a result of the wars that are being fought around the world, but are you really going to go into the Ukraine and collect that tungsten off the ground? I think not. And so
Not yet.
Mining cities is a thing. Tokyo, they're looking to recover things from urban wastewater flows. There'll be ongoing investment in this, but the general principle is that it costs so much to do it in most of these critical minerals that you're still going to be reliant upon the pipeline of primary projects.
Right. Yeah. And that makes total sense. Last question before we pivot to another critical resource is the policy response to a potential Chinese export control reaction function, right? We've seen previously, years ago, maybe a decade ago now, Japan trying to mine the seabed and trying to find a different input, a different, maybe less efficient or different critical mineral input to sidestep some of Chinese dominance or some of these supply chain vulnerabilities. Twofold. One, with Chinese new model, as you laid out, it seems ubiquitous. It seems that there's no real way out. And I think the second one is there a critical mineral that you think this audience should look at? Where if they do pull the trigger, this is one where the market is not looking sufficiently at.
So on the first question, the emphasis, particularly in Japan, has shifted from highest quality at lowest price, which was generally China, to security of supply. And there's a paranoia and anxiety now about being locked out of these supply chains. If you're trying to reflate a semiconductor sector, as Japan is, spending $50 billion on Project Rapidus, and you lose access to one or two things, that whole project can fail. And so Japan and the US last week, as part of this Critical Minerals Action Plan, endorsed the first deep sea mining operation. It's got Myanmar, it's in Japanese territorial waters. It illustrates how much of a premium they're now associating with security of supply, because it's 6 kilometers underwater. And so the costs of digging up this mud and dredging it, let alone the environmental impacts, are severe. And yet Japan wants to go ahead with that and now has the US backing to do it because it's theirs. It's theirs. And so it's a very good example. There is really no counterweight to China's dominance if they cut you off. Not so much of the minerals, you can get the minerals in other places, but the real vulnerability is that China, through that export control list, has also started to weaponize the midstream capabilities, including the machinery and the kit and the chemicals that are required to build a mine. That's how much control they have. And so the best approach, I think, will be, to find other forms of diplomatic machinations where there's existing leverage to build out the sector as I've described today, and to hopefully come to the table more as equals. Where it's trending, and this is where I do think you have to give credit to the US administration, to President Trump, they've identified this vulnerability in a way that no one was prepared to articulate before. But the solution is going to take decades.
There is no better segue of diplomacy, of leverage, of equals, and of critical bottleneck problems